In the summer of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front reached a moment that would become one of the most important turning points of the entire Second World War. After the devastating defeat at Stalingrad, German forces had lost much of their momentum, but they were not yet defeated. The German army still possessed powerful armored divisions and experienced commanders who believed that one decisive victory could restore the initiative. That opportunity appeared in the region around the Soviet city of Kursk, where a large bulge had formed in the front lines. This bulge extended deep into German-controlled territory, creating a tempting target for a massive encirclement operation. German planners believed that if they attacked the bulge from both the north and the south, they could surround and destroy a large portion of the Soviet army. This plan became known as Operation Citadel. The German strategy relied heavily on their armored forces, including some of their newest and most powerful tanks such as the Panther and Tiger. These machines were designed to be superior to Soviet tanks in both firepower and armor protection. German commanders hoped that by concentrating these powerful units they could break through Soviet defenses and achieve a decisive victory. However, the Soviet Union had learned from earlier battles and was now preparing for the German attack with careful planning and massive defensive efforts. Soviet intelligence had received information about the planned German offensive, and this allowed Soviet commanders to prepare one of the most heavily fortified defensive systems of the war. Instead of retreating or attempting to launch a premature attack, the Soviets chose to wait and absorb the German assault. Across the Kursk region they built multiple layers of defenses, including trenches, minefields, anti-tank guns, and fortified positions designed to slow and weaken the advancing German forces. The scale of these defenses was enormous, with millions of mines placed across the battlefield, creating deadly obstacles for advancing tanks. When the German offensive finally began in July 1943, the battlefield quickly became one of the largest concentrations of armored vehicles ever seen. Thousands of tanks from both sides moved toward each other across the fields and open terrain around Kursk. The German army attacked from the north and south, attempting to close the gap and surround Soviet forces inside the bulge. At the same time, Soviet defenders fought fiercely from their prepared positions, using anti-tank guns, artillery, and their own armored units to stop the German advance. The battle quickly turned into a brutal struggle where every kilometer of ground was contested. German tanks attempted to push through minefields while engineers worked under fire to clear paths for the advancing vehicles. Soviet defenses slowed the German advance significantly, forcing the attacking units to fight through multiple layers of resistance. One of the most intense moments of the battle occurred near the village of Prokhorovka, where large numbers of Soviet and German tanks clashed at close range. In this chaotic battle, tanks from both sides fired at each other from extremely short distances, sometimes only a few hundred meters apart. The battlefield was filled with smoke, fire, and explosions as armored vehicles moved through the chaos searching for targets. Soviet forces launched aggressive counterattacks using large formations of tanks, including the T-34, which had already proven itself to be one of the most effective tanks on the Eastern Front. The combination of speed, armor, and firepower allowed these tanks to engage German vehicles effectively, even when facing advanced tanks like the Tiger. Although German tanks often had superior long-range firepower, the close-range fighting at Prokhorovka reduced this advantage and created a chaotic battlefield where numbers and mobility played a critical role. The battle continued for days with heavy losses on both sides, as neither side was willing to give up ground. German forces made some progress, but they were unable to achieve the rapid breakthrough that had been essential to their earlier successes. The extensive Soviet defenses combined with strong counterattacks prevented the German army from completing the encirclement they had planned. As the battle continued, Soviet reserves were brought into the fight, adding even more strength to the defensive effort. At the same time, events on other fronts began to affect the situation. Allied forces had launched an invasion of Sicily, which forced Germany to divert attention and resources away from the Eastern Front. This further weakened the German ability to continue the offensive at Kursk. Eventually, German commanders realized that the operation could no longer achieve its objectives and the offensive was called off. What had been intended as a decisive German victory instead became a major turning point in the war. After the failure of Operation Citadel, the German army was never again able to launch large-scale offensives on the Eastern Front. Instead, they were forced into a defensive position while Soviet forces began launching their own powerful offensives, pushing westward across occupied territory. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated the growing strength of the Soviet army and the increasing effectiveness of its strategy and production capabilities. It also marked the beginning of a shift in momentum that would continue until the end of the war in Europe. The largest tank battle in history had not only resulted in massive losses but had also changed the direction of the entire conflict. As the battle continued to unfold across the Kursk salient, the scale of the fighting grew even larger and more intense with each passing day. German armored units pushed forward through heavily defended Soviet positions, but the progress was far slower than expected and every advance came at a heavy cost. Minefields hidden beneath the soil destroyed tanks before they could even engage the enemy, while anti-tank guns concealed in defensive lines opened fire on advancing German vehicles. Engineers worked desperately under constant artillery fire to clear safe paths through the minefields, but these narrow corridors became deadly choke points where Soviet defenders concentrated their firepower. At the same time, Soviet artillery units launched massive barrages that shook the battlefield and disrupted German formations before they could organize effective attacks. The noise of constant explosions and the sight of burning vehicles created a battlefield environment unlike anything seen before in the war. Above the ground, the air war also played a crucial role in the battle as both sides deployed large numbers of aircraft to support their forces. German dive bombers and fighters attempted to strike Soviet defensive positions and armored units, while Soviet aircraft responded with their own attacks against advancing German forces. The skies above Kursk were filled with aircraft engaging in intense dogfights, while bombers and ground attack planes targeted tanks and troop concentrations below. This combination of air power and armored warfare made the battle even more destructive and complex. As German forces pushed deeper into the southern part of the salient, they encountered some of the strongest Soviet defenses near Prokhorovka, where one of the most famous clashes of the battle took place. Large formations of Soviet tanks moved forward to counter the advancing German units, creating a chaotic and violent engagement. Tanks from both sides closed the distance rapidly and began firing at each other at extremely short ranges, where even the most heavily armored vehicles were vulnerable. The battlefield became a scene of confusion and destruction as vehicles maneuvered through smoke and dust, searching for targets while avoiding incoming fire. Soviet commanders relied on the mobility and numbers of their T-34 tanks to overwhelm German positions, while German crews attempted to use the superior range and accuracy of their guns to destroy Soviet vehicles before they could get too close. However, the close-quarters nature of the fighting often reduced the effectiveness of long-range firepower and forced both sides into brutal direct confrontations. Many tanks were destroyed within minutes of entering the battlefield, while others continued fighting despite damage to their tracks or engines. The intensity of the fighting at Prokhorovka became one of the defining moments of the entire battle. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Soviet counterattack succeeded in halting the German advance in that sector. This marked a critical point where the momentum of the battle began shifting away from Germany. While German forces had hoped to achieve a breakthrough and complete the encirclement of Soviet units, they now found themselves struggling to maintain their positions against increasing Soviet resistance. Reinforcements continued arriving on the Soviet side, adding fresh units to the battle while German forces were gradually weakened by continuous fighting and losses. At the same time, logistical problems began affecting German operations as fuel and ammunition had to be transported across long distances under constant threat of Soviet attacks. These challenges made it increasingly difficult for German commanders to sustain the offensive. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders carefully prepared their own counteroffensive operations designed to push German forces back once their attack had been stopped. The Red Army launched a series of powerful counterattacks across different sectors of the front, forcing German units to shift from offense to defense. This transition marked a major turning point not only in the Battle of Kursk but also in the overall war on the Eastern Front. For the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union, German forces were no longer able to dictate the pace of the battle. Instead, they were reacting to Soviet actions and attempting to hold their ground against increasingly strong attacks. The combination of strong defensive preparations, massive armored forces, and effective use of artillery and air power allowed the Soviet Union to absorb the German offensive and then push back with overwhelming force. As the battle drew toward its conclusion, the scale of destruction across the Kursk region became clear. Thousands of tanks had been destroyed or damaged while countless soldiers had been killed or wounded. Entire areas of the battlefield were covered with the remains of destroyed vehicles and artillery positions. The sheer size of the battle and the number of forces involved made it one of the largest and most significant engagements of the war. For German commanders, the failure of Operation Citadel represented a major setback that could not be easily recovered from. The loss of experienced troops and valuable equipment weakened their ability to conduct future operations, while the growing strength of the Soviet army made it increasingly difficult to regain the initiative. From this point forward, the Red Army would continue launching large-scale offensives that pushed German forces westward across Eastern Europe. The Battle of Kursk had not only stopped the last major German offensive in the east but had also demonstrated that the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. What began as a carefully planned German attack ended as a decisive turning point that changed the direction of the war and set the stage for the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. As the Battle of Kursk came to its final stages, the consequences of the massive clash began to reshape the entire Eastern Front in ways that would determine the outcome of the war. German forces that had once advanced rapidly across Soviet territory were now exhausted and weakened after weeks of intense fighting. Their tanks had suffered heavy losses not only from direct combat but also from mines, artillery, and constant Soviet counterattacks. Many of the new German tanks that had been expected to give them an advantage, such as the Panther, experienced mechanical problems that reduced their effectiveness during the battle. Crews struggled to keep these machines operational while facing continuous pressure from Soviet forces. At the same time, Soviet production continued supplying fresh tanks and equipment to the front, allowing their armies to maintain strength even after heavy losses. This difference in production capacity became one of the most important factors in the outcome of the battle. While Germany could produce advanced tanks in limited numbers, the Soviet Union was producing large numbers of reliable tanks like the T-34, which could be quickly sent into battle. As a result, Soviet forces were able to replace their losses more effectively and continue fighting with strong armored formations. After the German offensive was halted, Soviet commanders immediately launched large-scale counter-offensives across the region. These operations pushed German forces back from their positions and forced them into a defensive stance that would continue for the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. The Red Army began advancing westward, capturing territory that had previously been occupied by German forces. This shift in momentum marked a permanent change in the nature of the conflict. From this point onward, Germany would no longer be able to launch major strategic offensives in the east. Instead, they would be forced to defend against a series of powerful Soviet attacks that gradually pushed them back toward their own borders. The impact of the Battle of Kursk extended beyond the immediate battlefield. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union had developed the ability to plan and execute complex military operations involving large numbers of troops, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The coordination between different branches of the Soviet military improved significantly compared to earlier stages of the war. This increased effectiveness allowed Soviet forces to conduct large-scale offensives that overwhelmed German defenses in the months and years that followed. For the German army, the battle represented the loss of the initiative that had been central to their strategy since the beginning of the war. Blitzkrieg tactics relied on fast, decisive offensives, but after Kursk, Germany no longer had the strength to carry out such operations on the Eastern Front. The loss of experienced soldiers and the destruction of valuable equipment could not be easily replaced, especially as Allied bombing campaigns targeted German industry and reduced production capacity. At the same time, the opening of additional fronts by the Allies in Europe placed further pressure on German resources, forcing them to divide their forces across multiple battlefields. The Battle of Kursk is often remembered as the largest tank battle in history, not only because of the number of armored vehicles involved but also because of its scale and intensity. Thousands of tanks clashed across a vast area supported by artillery, aircraft, and infantry, creating a level of destruction that was unprecedented. The battle showed how modern industrial warfare could bring together massive amounts of equipment and manpower in a single engagement. It also highlighted the importance of preparation, intelligence, and logistics in determining the outcome of large-scale battles. The Soviet decision to build extensive defensive lines and wait for the German attack proved to be a critical factor in their success. By forcing German forces to fight through multiple layers of defenses, the Soviets were able to weaken the offensive before launching their own counterattacks. In the years following the war, military historians studied the Battle of Kursk as an example of how defensive strategy combined with strong industrial production could defeat even a well-planned offensive. The lessons learned from the battle influenced military thinking for decades and continue to be studied in military academies around the world. For the soldiers who fought in the battle, the experience was one of the most intense and dangerous of the entire war. The constant noise of explosions, the sight of burning vehicles, and the fear of sudden attacks created an environment of extreme stress and danger. Many soldiers later described the battle as one of the most chaotic and destructive experiences they had ever faced. Despite these conditions, both sides continued fighting with determination, as the outcome of the battle would have significant consequences for the future of the war. In the end, the Battle of Kursk marked the moment when the balance of power on the Eastern Front shifted permanently in favor of the Soviet Union. It ended Germany's ability to launch major offensives in the east and set the stage for a series of Soviet victories that would eventually lead to the capture of Berlin in 1945. The largest tank battle in history had not only determined the fate of the Eastern Front but had also played a crucial role in shaping the final outcome of the Second World War.